like 7, the vibes alive. Inner circles here, where voices thrive. Turn on your screens, let the magic unfold. Listening and healing as stories are told. Come on, come on, this is your time. No topics too tough, just heed the call. From mental health woes to justice we seek. Together we rise for the strong and the meek. A safe space for all, let's lift every voice. Inner Circle podcast where hearts unite. Sharing our truths, bringing hope to the light. Community strong, we're never alone. Together as one, we've created a home. With laughter and love, we break down the walls. No topics too tough, just heed the call. From mental health woes to justice we seek. Together we rise for the strong and the meek. A safe space for all, let's lift every voice. So join the conversation, let's set the tone. Inner Circle podcast where love is well known.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Inner Circle podcast. I'm your host, Abe Kamara, and tonight we are diving into a powerful and timely topic, tariffs and the immigrant economy. We are honored to be joined by a brilliant guest, Dr. Tyler Schipper, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of St. Thomas. He's a dynamic thinker who brings clarity to the often complex world of economics and public policy. Tonight, we'll explore how global trade policy like tariffs directly impact the lives of immigrants, entrepreneurs, and working families right here in Minnesota and around the country. So, Dr. Tyler Schipper, welcome to the show. We are glad to have you here. And today, folks, is Tuesday, April 29. I'm losing my time here, April 29. And this is going to be a great topic. Again, I'm your host, Abe Kamara, and the topic tonight is tariffs and the immigrant economy. Dr. Tyler Schipper, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. And
Yeah.
I'm always nervous with those introductions where it's like, oh, he's going to explain everything in nice, easy terms. You're going to understand 100%. And
Yeah.
I hope we get there, but I'm always a little bit like, I'm not sure I understand 100% with how things are changing every single day right now, but we'll do our best.
Okay. And folks, you can contribute to the conversation by calling our number 952-594-5154 or putting a comment in the chat. You can also follow us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, everywhere you get your podcast. So join this community. It's a growing community. So Dr. Schipper, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into economics? What was the motivation of you going into economics?
Sure. That's a long story, but I actually grew up in Iowa. I went to a small liberal arts college called Central College there. And then I ended up going out to the University of Oregon for graduate school.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I went to graduate school is that I tutored for some of my economics classes at Central College, and I decided I liked teaching. And so I went to graduate school because I knew I wanted to come back somewhere like St. Thomas to teach.
Okay.
I ended up enjoying my research more than I ever thought I would, but
Okay.
it's really the mentoring of students and doing student research that I enjoy doing. And that kind of leads me to investigate all kinds of economic questions because sometimes I follow my students where they go rather than
Okay.
my doctoral work was on actually informality in developing countries. So in lots of developing parts of the world, there's lots of businesses and entrepreneurs that never register with the government.
Okay.
And that's a big part of those economies. And so that's what I did my doctoral work on. But anymore, I do a lot of what's happening in the news. How do we break that down for people? How does it affect Minnesotans? And that's always fun because it's easy to bring into the classroom for my students.
Okay. Is there any personal story or anything that shaped that kind of shaped you or that kind of motivated you to get into economics?
Ooh. Yes.
Okay.
So a negative story, but like it's still a story, which would
Yeah,
be
yeah,
as an undergrad, I was actually doing a Spanish and political science double major, and I was going to go
sure.
into politics. And
Yeah, yeah.
I did a couple internships, and it realized I was answering phones, and people reacted to my interactions one of two ways: either you couldn't help them, and they were upset by that, or
Okay,
you did help them, and they were just like, "Well, that was your job. You were supposed to help me." I was
okay,
like, "This doesn't feel very rewarding. I would
okay.
rather work on the policy side of things." And that's what actually led me to economics, is that I was missing some math, and I was missing what I felt like were the abilities to shape policy. So that kind of led me to economics and then teaching. So um, I don't know if that's a happy, fuzzy story about how I ended up with econ, but it's part of the reason why we encourage students to do internships, even
Sure.
when they don't work out, is that it tells them something about themselves and what they like to do.
Okay. Well, tariffs has been in the news lately, right? Tariffs, there seems to be a global trade war. Can you break tariffs, break it down for our audience, right? We hear about, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean for the Irish person, and how does it impact them?
Yeah. So let's just start with kind of what a tariff is. And a
Yeah.
tariff is just a fancy name for a tax on a good that comes from outside the United States.
Okay.
I think it's interesting that when you think about U.S. history, like if you think about the Boston Tea Party, those were
Yeah.
more or less a response to tariffs,
Okay.
right? It was
Yeah.
the English trying to raise revenue by taxing a good that we could only get from England, which was tea. Uh,
Okay.
we have this history in the United States of tariffs. We used to be a big way that we raised revenue, uh,
Okay.
but they haven't been very high lately. Since the
Okay.
early 1900s, tariffs have kind of nosedived as a source of
Hmm.
revenue because we largely thought that it was better that we would get low cost goods and services from the rest.
Okay.
So this is kind of a reversion in that people should expect now that this is a tax on particularly the goods that they consume, and this could show up for higher prices for most people. And we can get
Okay.
into the details of that, but I
Sure.
think
Sure. Sure.
the simplest takeaway that if I had to give a 10-second answer of what tariffs are, they're a
Yeah.
tax on the goods that you consume, and the average person will probably have to pay higher prices if these tariffs stay in place.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that answer. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us. We have Dr. Tada Schipper on the show. And Dr. Schipper, that is Peterson. He's from the great city of Chicago. He's a regular panelist here. And here and I would definitely, ask the question. So, Peterson, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, and good
Yeah.
evening. Thank you, Dr. Schipper.
Hey, Peterson, how are you?
I'm all right.
Good.
Yeah. Let me give you the opportunity, Peterson. Any question for Dr. Schipper, right? I mean, we're off the bat.
Okay, yeah. So thank you so much for being here tonight, and welcome to the Inner Circle podcast. I just heard the last part of your answer to the question. So, as far as tariffs go, does that mean it's more of a commodity goods that are taxed?
Yeah, it's actually anything that is imported. So some of it will be commodities, but it can also be things like toys from China or cars from Japan. Um, the range of tariffs that we're seeing right now are very different in scale than we've seen in the last more or less century. Going back, probably the Great Depression is where you'd have to go back to, and even then, the scale of global trade is so very different today than it was
Yeah.
during the Great Depression.
Hmm.
So it's not just commodities, it's kind of across the board. Right now, if you were cars are an interesting case right now because the cars that are on the lot right now, you won't
Yeah.
see prices probably go up for those cars. But as that inventory leaves the lot, and if these tariffs stay in place, the new cars that replace them will probably be at higher prices. And as soon as you start talking about adding even 1, 2, 3+% to a car, that's a big expense. That
Sure.
ends up being a lot of money for average people.
So when can folks expect, right? I know, I mean, the new administration has only been in office 100 days, right? Today, I think max 100 days. When can we expect, like, even for for cars, when can we expect car prices to reflect, the new tariffs or like, goods from China or from Canada or from Mexico? When can we expect prices, right? The average
Yeah.
consumer, when can they expect to see those prices?
So let's unpack that a little bit because the four different places you named might be very different. So
Oh, okay.
with cars, cars, we might start to see prices like 6 months down the road because of
Oh,
those inventories. And even today, there was a new change in policy with respect to car tariffs, that there's going to
yeah.
be some exemptions there. I
Okay.
haven't read through all the fine details. And I would love to talk more about cars because cars are super interesting with all of this. But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I think the ones that are most in the news right now are goods coming from China. So think
Okay.
about things like appliances, kids' toys, um, small consumer electronics like uh, iPhones, for instance. Those might have an exception at the moment, but maybe in the future they will also be on that list.
Sure.
And we're already starting to see some decreases in the number of ships that are arriving at West Coast ports.
Okay.
Uh, and what's happening there is that you get big retailers like a Best Buy or Target, and they're like,
Yeah.
these things are too expensive for us right now, and we're going to cancel our shipment. And as soon as you get fewer of those goods on shelves, you'll see either shortages or you start seeing prices go up for consumers. And so I think we're just on the leading edge of some of those prices to start hitting consumers.
Okay.
I doubt we won't see it in the data. The data is usually like looking back a month, so we probably
Yeah.
won't see it this month, but
Uh,
we're getting closer to where consumers are going to start to see it. And probably if you've carefully looked through your spam inbox or your promotions folder,
Yeah.
you've got some business that you've interacted with lately that has warned you that they're going to have to raise prices. So
Oh wow.
for
Okay.
me, I rock climb, and I saw this email from Black Diamond. It's a rock climbing company, and they produce a
Yeah.
lot of their stuff
Yeah.
in different countries around the world. And they sent an email that starting in May, they're going to be raising almost all of their prices 10 to 25%.
Oh
And
wow.
so these prices are starting to happen, or these price increases are starting to happen, but
Okay.
they'll kind of trickle in over time as different companies decide how much can we pass on to consumers, how much can we not pass on to consumers. Are there places we could switch away from to China to some other supplier?
Sure.
Lots of complexities, but I
Yeah.
think we are starting to see those price changes.
Okay. Peterson, question from you?
Okay. Yeah, for me, I don't really know the history of tariffs and when it was first implemented, like in the US, for example. So when these changes come on at first, is it something that the consumers or the citizens can do to kind of make the government think like, oh, maybe this is not a good idea, we should revert this? Is that something that we can do as consumers?
That's a tough question about who has power over the modern economy, and um, I don't know. Um, I worry right now that the only thing that has reliably changed behavior from the current administration has seemed to be big fluctuations in the stock market. Um, Most of the available polling right now says that tariff policy is unpopular.
Okay.
That even people think that when it might have good effects in the long run, they might not be willing to put up with the short run. We can talk about short run, long run, I think, at
Sure.
some point. But
Yeah.
um, so I think the polling has already been pretty clear that a lot of people don't want these tariffs to go into effect because they're already feeling squeezed with their budgets, and feeling the price of anything goes up feels bad right now. And they're willing to express that in opinion polling. But
Okay.
there's a lot of gridlock in Washington, and a lot of the power for tariff policy is concentrated in the White House, which is actually kind of strange because we typically think about tax policy being Congress that gets to make that decision.
Sure.
But Congress, way back, going back to the Great Depression, they were like, hey, this is actually really hard for us to decide. And we passed this really bad Great Depression increase in tariffs. So we're going to give a lot of this power back to the executive branch.
Oh,
And so that's why it resides there now. But at any point, if we could actually pressure members of Congress, they could take back the ability to um, pass tariffs unilaterally in the White House. That this is actually a congressional authority that they gave to the White House in decades past.
okay. For families though, like already struggling with high inflation, right? COVID brought a lot of high inflation for the last 4 years. I mean, if you go to the grocery store, prices are high all over. How can we now navigate, right? Families already struggling with inflation, right? Everywhere people, everyone is complaining about inflation. Prices are so high. how can they navigate this current environment with tariffs? What's that going to do to family budget?
Nothing good. Unfortunately, I think that how wide these tariffs are make it really hard to find good substitutions to avoid price increases.
Okay.
So for instance, if this was only um, on Chinese goods, for instance, well, maybe if people didn't buy as many appliances or didn't buy electronic goods, for instance, they might avoid that. And that would still be hard to do given how much stuff comes from China. But maybe you could avoid some of those things. But we have 10% tariffs on almost all of our trading partners, with the exception of Mexico and Canada, and it gets fuzzy there.
Yeah.
And that means that basic goods that we don't produce in the United States are also going to see price increases. One good example is coffee. We produce like near zero coffee in the United States. There's a little bit in Hawaii, but the rest
Yeah.
of it is from elsewhere in the world. Coffee used to have a 0% tariff on it. And
Yeah.
we're in an environment right now where there has been droughts and bad growing seasons in Brazil and Vietnam, which was
Yeah.
already causing coffee prices to go up.
Okay.
And now we're going to make it even more expensive for American consumers. And unless your suggestion is, well, I'm not going to drink coffee anymore, which I think is going to be hard for a lot of people, a lot of these tariffs are simply unavoidable.
So does that mean the lattes like a Starbucks, or Caribou coffee might be going up, $10,
Yeah.
$50?
How much, I think it depends a little bit on coffee shop to coffee shop, but
Yeah.
there are certainly a lot of, let's say, so we could talk about Minneapolis. So
Yeah.
Dogwood
Yeah.
is my neighborhood coffee shop. I love Dogwood. They have pricey lattes, and I think we can be honest about that. They are pricey lattes.
Sure.
Some of those higher end coffee shops have had the ability to kind of hold off on raising prices, but these are going to be big enough shocks that even those, I will call them boutique coffee shops, are probably
Yeah.
going to be affected in similar ways to places like Starbucks. And essentially what's happening is, because of these bad crops, you have everybody's fighting over a smaller amount of coffee, and that's
Mhm.
going to push up prices. And then we're going to put this tariff on top of it when it comes in the US.
Sure.
That's going to affect coffee up and down, whether it's your little can of Folgers or whether it's your fancy latte that takes 30 seconds to order all the add-ons to it.
Okay. Well, folks, tonight we are discussing tariffs and the immigrant economy. Right, tariffs has been hot off the press. It's been making news lately. Even today, as Dr. Schipper said, there was news about tariffs, things like that. So you can join the conversation by calling our number 952-594-5154. Or you can put a comment in the chat if you have a question about tariffs. How is it going to affect you? How is it going to affect your family budget? If you have any question for Dr. Schipper, please call our number 952-594-5154 or put a comment in the chat. Peterson, any question from you?
Yeah, so when we're talking about tariffs and the immigrant community, they are already at a disadvantage to begin with. So how do you think the impact on like just the broad immigrant community would be with all these like tariffs?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the focus on tariffs has been immediately about prices, because in the news, people have been like, well, my prices have already gone up. I don't want them to go up more. But for the immigrant community in particular, there's often a saying for people of color, but I'm assuming it also applies to the immigrant communities. Often it's a first fired and last hired mentality when we go
Yeah.
into a recession.
Sure.
And so I think that actually is the bigger concern, is that one of the things that tariffs have done is made the probability of a recession more likely.
Yeah.
And that probability of losing your job is probably a bigger impact on a lot of households than even these price increases. We've heard a lot more about the price increases, but I'm actually more worried about the increased probability of recession for people of color, English learners, etc., because they're much more likely to be the first ones that lose their jobs when the economy slows down.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question then. So does tariffs deepens inequality, right? You have the have and the have-nots.
Yeah.
Folks in the middle class and maybe in the upper class might be able to weather this storm, but does it deepen inequality, especially for the immigrant population who are just coming here, who are trying to navigate the system, and then now you have this extra burden of tariffs?
Yeah. So I think in the short term, there's probably a different effect for income versus wealth.
Okay.
So let's talk about the income side of things first,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah. Yeah.
on the income side of things, economists would describe a tariff as a regressive tax in
Okay.
that it is going to fall hardest among the people that have the least. So, because of those price increases, if you're a low income individual, the
Hmm.
amount that you pay in extra money for because of tariffs might be smaller, but
Okay.
that smaller amount is still a bigger percentage of your budget.
Okay.
And so, in that sense, tariffs are regressive, where our federal income tax is actually progressive. And so, this would deepen inequality because we're taking more tax revenue from lower income households as opposed to higher income households. And I don't think I'm out on a limb in terms of what I believe, which is I want to see a progressive tax policy, and whether it's a sales tax or a tariff, it is regressive and it's going to fall hardest among the people that have the least, and I think that's problematic.
Okay.
On the wealth side, it's a
Yeah.
little bit more confusing because of the stock market, and we can unpack that later if people want to talk stock market
Sure.
chaos that has been happening lately.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, we have a question here from a listener who said, "What's responsible for the trade deficit in the U.S., if any? Trump seems to be using tariffs against other countries as if they are responsible for this, ignoring the effects on U.S. consumers."
Yeah, that is an awesome question, and like so many things in economics, there's not a single one answer, and so
Yeah,
maybe I'll talk about a few different things.
sure.
One has simply been that American consumers like to consume stuff, and we like to consume inexpensive stuff.
Okay.
So a good example and uh, would be the country of Lesotho, where we have a trade deficit with Lesotho,
Yeah.
and one way to look at that from the Trump's perspective is, oh, they're cheating us. They're taking our money. The problem is that Lesotho doesn't need much that we produce in the United States. They don't need Boeing airplanes, but we really like something that they have,
Okay.
diamonds. And because of that, we want something that they have. They don't want much that we have. That creates a trade deficit there. Okay. So there are lots of examples of that where American consumers are getting essentially good deals because
Yeah.
other countries are providing goods and services that we want. There is also some structural parts of this, and this is where we got to be fair to the Trump administration. There are countries where they have tariffs on our goods
Hmm.
that might be unfair, or where China has unfair rules for American companies to compete in China. And there are legitimate grievances there that can also cause trade deficits.
Okay.
And then the final one is simply that there is because the U.S. has long been kind of privileged in terms of it's the center of global trade. That has often meant that we had a stronger U.S. dollar, which makes our domestic manufacturing look relatively more expensive to the rest of the world, and that can also have an effect on the trade deficit. So there would be like big three reasons there,
Sure.
but it's a long list, and that's part of the reason why policy here is so complicated. Is that it's not one thing that can be done. It's probably
Yeah.
a big long list of things that should be done incrementally to change this over time.
Okay. What's about the argument that the reason why we need the government needs to have these tariffs in place is to bring back jobs, right? To the reshoring of job. I mean, what's about that argument? I mean, what do you make of that argument to bring back jobs to the U.S.?
I think that there is an appealing logic to that argument, in that these jobs generally left the United States when we had things like NAFTA, which lowered trade barriers between us and Canada.
Yeah.
And so thinking about reversing that seems like it should bring back a lot of these manufacturing jobs.
Okay.
The problem with that is that we're not in the same world that we were in the early 2000s. We're not in the same world when a lot of these tariff barriers went down. And we also don't have a good experiment of this degree. So
Sure.
can we categorically rule out that some jobs will come back? there will be some jobs that come back. You'll see announcements in the headlines that such and such company is bringing back some jobs. But on average, what we know from the data is that the number of jobs created are done so at a very high cost. So there's a couple estimates out there from 2018 when we had steel and aluminum tariffs that we created new steelworking jobs, but it was something like 6 to 7 times what an average worker would make,
Yeah.
was how much it costs consumers on average. And so
Wow.
these are really, really high cost jobs programs to the extent that they bring back people. The
Okay.
other part of this is if you imagine a new factory opening up in the United States,
Yeah.
that factory is not going to be filled with a production line that has just tons and tons of workers on that production line. It's going to be filled with robotics and AI, not creating jobs, but they have to be able to compete with really low wage labor in other countries. And that's going to be easiest to do with additional capital and additional machinery. And
Okay.
so it's not going to be the type of jobs program that people would like to see. I understand why people want to see it, but I'm highly skeptical that if we got to that version of the world going through all this pain, that the ends would justify the means.
And do you think, like, let's assume that these jobs come back, do you think the immigrant labor force can benefit from such a job? Or I mean, is that at the higher end of, like, I mean, employment or so?
You know, this is one of those places where I want to put a plug in that if we're talking about kind of immigrant workers that don't have a college degree, I think
Yeah.
that is a harder sell.
Sure.
But the immigrant community, there are lots of people that have college degrees that are way smarter than me that are going to be out there programming the AI machines, and I'll just be, I don't know, letting them take my job. But so it is kind of going to be there might be some additional opportunities out there, but on the whole, I think that this is bad for workers at large,
Okay.
and probably worse for workers as you move down the income spectrum. That it's going to be harder and harder for low wage workers to find jobs in an economy where we have more and more capital producing stuff. So
Okay.
I think there's ways to address that don't just increase costs on low wage families.
Okay. Peterson, question from you.
Yeah, another question I have there been any data from the past of the positive impact or advantage of having tariffs?
There's not great data on the positive effects. There's a study that economists love to talk about, and being one of their number, I love to talk about it too. So, in 2018, we put a new tariff on washing machines, and this was both from China but from other countries as well. And
Yeah.
one of the pretty direct impacts was washing machines were more expensive in the U.S. This was consistent with economic theory. It's consistent with what economists have been saying this time around, that prices will go up. But two other things happened that are important to recognize. One was dryers didn't have a tariff, but the price of dryers went up as well because people tended to consume or buy dryers along with their washers, and they were like, oh, they're a set, so I have to buy them together. And so, companies took advantage of that and they raised the price of dryers too. The other thing that happened was even washing machines that were made in the US increased in price because those manufacturers were like, well, those foreign washing machines are now more expensive. We can raise our prices and still compete. And so in terms of the pass through to consumers, it was actually more than 100% because it ended up raising prices of even non-tariffed goods.
Okay.
And that is something we could see this time around, that even with American-made cars, if foreign cars go up in price, American manufacturers also have incentives to increase their prices to roughly match or compete differently. And that's one of the scary things about tariffs, is that it more or less means less competition. And competition is one of the things that protects consumers, that they get better prices and when lots of firms are trying to compete for your dollar.
Okay. Do tariffs make it harder? I mean, you talk about inflation or tariffs. Do they make it harder for ordinary folks, especially immigrants, to build wealth, right? Right now everything is so high, housing costs is so high. Does it make it harder for the average person, especially immigrants, right, to build wealth?
Absolutely. This is one of those places where there are well-documented large wealth gaps in the United States. As much as we talk about income inequality, there's even larger wealth inequality. Um, and certainly to the extent that this is going to take more money out of the family budget, it makes it harder to build up wealth. And if you can't build wealth, you can't pass it on to your kids. And if you can't pass it on to your kids, those gaps between um, Black families and white families, or Native families and immigrant families, those get wider over time.
Sure.
And that's one of the hardest things for. I teach a class on economic inequality that's really hard for students to understand, which is they're all familiar with the phrase "it takes money to make money,"
Yeah.
but then they don't apply that to, we have these wealth gaps that exist today.
Yeah.
We're not really doing much to change those wealth gaps, and hence those wealth gaps either decrease very, very slowly or can often increase depending on what's happening in the business cycle. So this is a policy that does not make those better. Um, the stock market is a little confusing how it affects that
Sure.
answer, because
Yeah. Yeah.
when the stock market drops, it probably affects the people with the most
Sure.
stock, which is the higher part of the income distribution. But those effects are usually pretty temporary. And so overall, it ends up in the longer term increasing wealth inequality.
And just along with that, right? In the immigrant community, you have a lot of small businesses, and some of them source their goods from from their country of origin. How's that going to impact them? The immigrant small businesses, right? A lot of immigrants own small businesses. Thinking about the Asian store, the African markets, or the Oriental markets. How's that going to impact them?
So my first inclination would be that small businesses are far more susceptible to the business cycle. And so when we go into a recession, that the failure rate for small businesses is going to be higher. And to that extent, that a lot of the businesses you're talking about are going to be more susceptible to those negative effects of tariffs. And at least living here in Minnesota, like in Minneapolis, like I know the types of businesses you're talking about, and I think it's one of the cool parts of the fabric of Minneapolis, and that's an aspect I hadn't really thought about, is how many kind of unique immigrant linked bakeries, or there's a bakery down the street from me. That's why I think of that one. It's how cool that is to the tapestry of Minnesota, and that you could lose a lot of those because of this type of policy.
Okay, Peterson, question from you.
Yeah, another question I had: how does the tariff impact immigration at the level of those who are coming for like work, who come on work visas and things like that? How does the whole tariff impact that?
I think it's really hard to separate this tariff policy from immigration policy writ large in the United States right now. In part because of immigration policy, in part because of tariff policy, one of the things that we're seeing is less willingness to come to the United States, whether that's for tourism or potentially to see family. And that has economic impacts, because then we don't have foreigners spending money in the United States. And this is one of those interesting aspects of trade deficits, is that when you think about the trade deficit, it's not just goods, it's also services. And when you have somebody from Europe or Latin America or Africa come here for a visit, that's a service. It's tourism dollars that are coming into the U.S. from abroad, and that helps make the trade deficit smaller. Unless we seem to be so anti other countries that people stop coming here, either because they don't feel like it's safe, or they're doing it out of protest because we've treated other countries unfairly. So I'm happy to dive into immigration policy as well, because I think there's a lot to say there about the U.S. economy right now as well.
Okay.
But it is hard to separate from tariff policy, which seems to be directed against the rest of the world, where immigration policy kind of seems similar, that it is directed against the rest of the world, or what is seen as others in the economy. Unfairly, in my perspective, obviously, but that is kind of the combining thread through those two different policies.
So, what do you think these two factors, then, right, the immigration policy of the new administration and the tariffs policy, is going to do to the overall economy? I know you talked about recession earlier, but what other damage could they do, right? I mean, the administration keeps talking about mass deportation, right? There are a lot of fears in immigrant communities. You hear stories how some folks are afraid to go to work or to open their local businesses, and then now you have the whole tariffs policy, right, that might be affecting jobs and things like that. How is that going to affect the overall U.S. economy, which has been very, very resilient over the last couple of years?
Yeah. The jobs market has been very resilient despite, high inflation even that but the emphasis on immigration and it's very broad in terms of legal immigration,
Yeah,
undocumented workers, people that might be perceived to not have legal status.
yeah,
Um, and you're absolutely right that is causing people, for instance, not to show up to work sometimes. That hurts the economy. That is leading to people maybe not be wanting to attend college in the United States because they don't want to have their student visa revoked.
sure.
And college is one of those things. I mean, I'm biased here, right? I'm teaching at University of St. Thomas. Like,
Yeah,
we think we teach college really good here, and lots of American universities, and we want international students to come here. But there is a fear that if we are anti-immigrant and anti-foreigners, there's a sense of xenophobia here that makes more and more college students not want to come here to get degrees, and that means that they're less likely to stay here after their college degree is done and bring their sense of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit to the economy. Like, I think the US does the best when we take is probably the wrong word. When we encourage people that have the best ideas and the hardest work ethic
yeah.
wherever they're from in the world and we encourage them to stay here, that helps our economy. It doesn't hurt it.
Okay. I mean, just real quick then, I mean, as a college professor on campus there, right, you've been hearing about all this news about colleges, in the news, student visa being canceled. How's the University of St. Thomas? I mean, what's happening there from your vantage point?
Yeah, that's a great question and a tough one. I don't know the exact numbers of students that have or had not had visas canceled. I think that our take has always been that we want new ideas at St. Thomas. We want a diversity of students because every different perspective you get deepens the education that we can provide here.
Hmm.
Um, and it's always been part of our experience that immigration is kind of fundamental to who we were. I mean, a different type of immigration. So John Ireland, the founder of St. Thomas, was
Yeah,
about the Irish immigration that was the problem, if you will,
yeah,
in his day. But that kind of what leads us to still be. We want immigrants coming to St. Thomas because that's in our founding DNA. That we think education should be available to everyone. That we want to nurture that sense of what can you do in the world? How can you make the world better? How can you make the economy better? So this is certainly something we don't want to see. We don't want to see immigrants in any sense scared to show up to school.
hmm,
And hopefully, this is something that some of this has been rolled back already by the administration. I'm hoping because they realize that this doesn't help the U.S. economy. That if
yeah.
you if fewer and fewer college students here, that simply is fewer people spending money in the U.S.
Okay. Okay. Peterson, question from you.
Yeah, follow up to the question about the schools and things. Even if it's not the tariffs impact on these schools, it says something that these bigger schools, we've been hearing about Harvard and other Ivy League institutions. Is that something that they can maybe advocate to the government to say, okay, if these policies are implemented, it's going to affect the enrollment into our programs, and further down, we're not going to have enough people contributing to the economy. Is this something that uh, the schools can do, or are their hands tied?
Yeah, I would say that some of those bigger schools, like the Harvards of the world, right now are having bigger problems than what's going to happen with tariffs in terms of having federal funding cut off, for instance. Uh, but to the extent that this is a price increase generally in the economy and colleges are already trying to make sure that they're providing the best experience and paying the best professors and hiring enough staff for the dorms, and those costs go up, either that has to get passed on to tuition or they have to find the dollars somewhere and cut some other services. And so I think that's always been the challenge in higher education, was to make sure that we're providing the best education at the lowest cost, and it's hard to do. And so I think there are other headwinds for higher education, but tariffs certainly add to that, and it makes it harder for them to not raise tuition, along with. And actually, this brings a broader point about how we're worried about these initial price increases because some goods are more expensive in the US. And then there's a second wave where a place like St. Thomas or a insurance company says, "Oh, we're having to buy more paper now, and that paper is more expensive. We need to pass that cost on to our customers." And then you get insurance costs, which aren't imported; those go up, and then you get kind of this second level of inflation. And that's a little bit what places like the Federal Reserve are worried about.
And then that's a great, I mean, that's a great segue right there. Right? How is it going to have a ripple effect, right? To this, I mean, for the service economy, right? I mean, the United States, even though we do still manufacture things here, but it's heavily reliant on the service economy. How is that going to impact that, right? For example, like like taking vacations, flights, buying flights, buying airline tickets, or like I mean, so many other things. Right? As I said, this country is heavily dependent on the service economy. How's that going to have a ripple effect on that?
Mhm. Yeah, and you can see that ripple effect in a couple ways, right? One is that inflation mechanism where people say, "Well, I'm having to spend more money to buy my stuff. I need a higher wage now." The other one would be, for an example, like Delta and Sun Country, two airlines that operate out of Minneapolis.
Yeah.
They've both reported decreasing demand for air travel right now, and that's
Yeah.
largely coming from uncertainty around tariff policy. And certainly that has effects on all kinds of workers, including immigrant workers, when they start having fewer people loading airplanes and working on airplanes and piloting airplanes. Like, that's a big source of jobs in a city like the Twin Cities. And if there's less demand for air travel because people are just concerned about the state of the economy, that's going to have a kind of ripple effect on employment as well.
Okay. And then if there's I mean, you said earlier, I mean, the possibility of a recession. If there's a recession coming, what can the immigrant community do, right? All over the United States, not only here in Minnesota, right? To prepare for like an eventual, recession that might be coming because of all of these policies, right? There's the immigration policy, there's
Mhm.
tariffs, there's so many stuff going on.
Yeah. What you can do during a recession, I think, is it's always hard, because what you'll hear from personal finance experts is
Yeah.
it always feels wrong to say out loud, so I'm going to repeat it, but like, it's, "Oh, you should make sure that you have 3 to 6 months in an emergency fund." And that's great, but you're often giving this advice to people that are struggling to make ends meet as is, much less putting
Yeah.
away 3 to 6 months, and
Yeah.
so that doesn't feel very helpful.
Okay.
Um so I often kind of go a different way with this, which is, I think there's a tendency when you lose your job to assume that it was something that you did wrong or that you're not a good worker, and kind of dispelling that people lose their jobs during recessions for reasons unrelated to their work performance. And because of that, destigmatizing any use of public services, whether the big one would be unemployment insurance. That if you lose your job due to a recession and you are in a position that is eligible for unemployment insurance,
Sure.
you should not feel any hesitation whatsoever from using it. You have been paying into that the whole time. Just like if you wrecked your car, you'd be like, "Insurance company, I wrecked my car, pay me." That's what unemployment insurance is. And so
Mhm.
destigmatizing it as somehow you're using too much government policy, I think is grossly unfair to a bunch of people that have been paying in all along the way.
Okay. Well, folks, tonight we are discussing tariffs and the immigrant economy. Has the administration policy regarding tariffs affecting, family budget, affecting family finances? There's already been high inflation, and now we have tariffs. So tonight we are discussing tariffs and the immigrant economy. So you can contribute to the conversation by putting a comment in the chat or calling our number 952-594-5154. There's a question here from a comment. Is there any legal mechanism that you know of that the University of St. Thomas is doing to protect like international students? Do you know of anything that St. Thomas is doing to protect international students?
Thanks for that question. I don't have any insights onto what kind of legal mechanisms there are. I
Mhm.
can only speak for myself that uh, any conversations I've had with international students where they've expressed that it feels like a scary environment to them right now, and those are heartbreaking conversations that
Okay.
we want every one of our students to feel safe studying here, and um, but I can't speak to the any legal mechanisms that St. Thomas has that it's kind of beyond my expertise. Other than I work with these students, I want them to be here. I grieve for the fact that we're in a world where they don't feel safe pursuing their education right now.
Okay. Minnesota has a very diverse economy, agriculture, manufacturing, trade. We are very close to Canada. We trade with, Mexico. A lot of the agricultural products I hear that they go to China. How is this? Do you know what specific industry right now in Minnesota that have been affected mostly by these tariffs?
Ooh. Um, I haven't seen the exact numbers, but I would guess that and this is not going to be uh, one of the biggest industries that has been affected, at least in 2018, when there was a trade war with China, was agriculture.
Okay.
Because one of the things that happens when we put trade barriers in other countries in the form of tariffs is that they respond. And that's where you get a classic trade war. So we tell China that we're going to put 145% tariff on their goods. They respond in kind and say they're going to put 145% tariff on our goods. One of the big things that we supply to China are soybeans. And so it affects greater Minnesota quite a bit. I would guess that you'll also see some impacts for um, like medical manufacturing. So
Yeah,
places like we export a lot of goods from Minnesota
sure.
or medical devices, for instance, that go to other parts of the world. That again, I haven't seen exact data on that, but I'm guessing that that would be another industry that uh, would have some impacts of this if this trade war continues and heats up with other countries as well.
Okay. Peterson, any question from you?
Yeah, so I want to understand when you said the tariff on something is like 145%, for example. Uh, for the sake of numbers, what would that be if something usually costs $100 to import? Then what would that cost?
This is such a great question, and I don't want to bury the lead, so I'm going to say I don't know first, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit more. Okay, um,
Okay. Okay.
because I don't want to overplay expectation about price increases, and I think that's part of the fear is that somebody will be like, "Oh, this $100 good now is going to be well, whatever my math is. Let's just go with 100%. We'll make my math easier and be like, oh, it's going to be $200 now."
Yeah.
The problem is that we have to think about the price of the item when it comes into the US. And so even if you saw that $100 item on the shelf at Target, it might only be $50 when it comes to the US. And so that 145% is going to be a smaller effect on that $50. Now Target has to figure out how much of that are we going to pass on to our consumers versus how much of it are we going to eat in terms of profits. And so the ultimate pass through to consumers is going to be a fraction of that 145% in terms of what they actually see. Um, the best evidence we have there is that a big chunk of it's going to get passed on to consumers, but it's going to depend a little bit industry to industry. Some companies are probably going to try and hold off and see if tariffs go away before they have to pass this on to consumers, but they can only do that so long given how high some of these tariffs are. So I wish I could give you an exact number. If I could, like I would get to be the go-to economist for everything right now, and until they realize that those numbers were all wrong because the world's changing so quickly. But I do think that that point about expectations is important. That you shouldn't expect everything at Target to be 145% more expensive because it's on the value that Target imports the good for, and then they'll decide on how much to pass along to you. I will say the other here's another good rule of thumb is that um, if, for instance, tariffs on Mexico go back into place, and so we have a good like avocados that we get the vast majority of our avocados from Mexico, a handful of other countries. But if those there's not big margins on avocados because lots of different places have them in the US. So they have pretty small margins, which means that if their price goes up from tariffs, grocery stores, for instance, would have to pass on more of that to consumers, that they can't reduce their profits very much and still make money on avocados. And so things like food items, if the Canadian and Mexican tariffs go back into place, would be places where you would see, I think, more pass through to consumers than some other higher margin items.
Okay. Like early April, the administration was very, there was a huge marketing about Liberation Day, about reciprocal tariffs, like, so it's like, what's the rationale behind that? And do you think it was more about, I mean, I couldn't understand that, right? There was so many hype about it, things like that. Can you just maybe explain that a little bit to our audience about Liberation Day, reciprocal tariffs? We saw this huge display about, countries from all over. I mean, Peterson and I from Liberia, but you saw countries from, Nigeria, Ghana, everywhere, right? Where, I mean, there were tariffs, right? There were so many things on social media and things like that. I mean, can you help our audience kind of understand that a little bit?
Yeah. So I'll tell a story about my reaction to Liberation Day, which was I had agreed to do a TV interview immediately after the announcement, but I was going
Yeah.
to be in class during the actual announcement. And so I had an idea of what was going to be announced. And then I kind of walk out of class and just took a quick look at headlines because I had like 30 seconds before I talked to this person. And I was not able to take in enough information in those 30 seconds because of how much chaos had been unleashed while I'd been in class for just an hour. And so one of those interviews where I sweat a lot thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much more I need to know. But also then realizing after the fact that it was going to take several days for people to really figure out what was happening anyways. And I was no more in the unknown as anybody else at that point. And
Sure.
so yeah, let's unpack. When I hear the word reciprocal, and I think what most people heard when they heard reciprocal is that if China has a 10% tariff on American soybeans, we're going to put a 10% on tariff on Chinese soybeans, and we would have the same tariff rate for the same goods with a bunch of different countries. Turns out that was too hard, and so we were just going to do like the same average tariff. And there's actually historical precedent for this. This was
Okay.
following the Great Depression. There was a Reciprocal Tariffs Act that we gave the president the ability to negotiate tariffs so that they would
Yeah.
match what other countries have.
Okay.
Problem is that the administration didn't do that. Instead, they created a reciprocal tariff that tried to take into account how big our trade deficit was with each country. So countries where we had a bigger trade deficit, they automatically got a bigger tariff. And so it didn't really matter what their tariffs were. It
Okay.
just mattered if we had a big trade deficit with them. And I think that's what left a lot of economists kind of head spinning, which
Okay.
was that they weren't reciprocal at all. It was, and the rationale behind that was, oh, there's lots of things other than tariffs that affect trade. I agree with that, but let's not call them reciprocal tariffs that don't actually put the tariff into the equation that you use to figure it out. So one of the oddities of Liberation Day, well, two oddities. One, it was big, and that's why you saw markets react in such a crazy way, and just kind of the floor dropped out because it was
Mhm.
much bigger than anyone was expecting.
Sure.
The other thing that happened was we were actually penalizing some of the countries where we had encouraged American firms to go so that they weren't in China. And so
Okay.
actually following 2018, where a bunch of countries and the pandemic, a bunch of countries or a bunch of US companies like, well, we have to have supply chains that are more robust and don't rely as much on China.
Yeah.
And so they moved production to places like Vietnam and Mexico and other places in Southeast Asia. That made there be larger trade deficits in those places.
Sure.
And then that caused us to put a bigger tariff on those places. And so it's like, if you're in supply chain or logistics right now, like, and you're working for a big company that has global supply chains, it's a bad lifestyle right now for those people. But I'm it's unfortunate for them because they're just trying to figure out how they're going to get the goods that their company needs and get them to consumers for the lowest price. And the goalposts keep changing every single day.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Peterson, question from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting. You mentioned a little bit earlier about stocks. So, with the tariffs going on, what is your take on the impact it's having on the stock market?
Yeah. What is really tricky about the stock market is that people are forward looking about how they're thinking about how much a company is worth. And
Yeah.
so if you think a company is going to have more profits in the future, you might buy more of that stock today and hence that stock price goes up. Now, with tariffs, all of a sudden you're going to talk about companies either having to lower their profit margins or have fewer consumers, which meant their profits would fall. And hence we saw stocks fall all over the world because their input prices were going to be higher and they would have fewer consumers. Right now, you're getting changes in the stock market that change on a daily basis by trying to interpret. So, for instance, today there was some news that the Trump administration was likely going to announce that they made a deal with a country. Um, Not which country, but a country. And so that was the headline that maybe it signals that this was all a negotiating tactic and stocks maybe go up because right now it looks like this is a negotiating tactic and maybe tariffs aren't in place. Um, but more broadly, we've been going through that process now for a while and it seems to change on a daily basis. And if you are a company in the US, you're having a real hard time deciding, oh, do I want to open a new factory here or in Vietnam or China? They don't want to make those type of investments right now because they don't know what that tariff landscape is going to look like tomorrow, next, much less a year from now. And so I think that's still where it affects the economy and still affects the stock market is that there is so much uncertainty that firms aren't wanting to make investments, which means they don't build that next factory, they don't hire the new workers to run it, and that's how it ends up affecting people that even don't have stocks. But certainly, there are plenty of people out there that own stocks, and it's been topsy turvy to say the least. Particularly for seniors, I think this is one of those hardest things: is that seniors that don't have a lot of time to earn money back in the stock market, those type of days like Liberation Day hurt a lot.
Okay. I know you just talk about the uncertainty, right? When you hear about businesses talking about the current environment, it's all about uncertainty. They don't know, what to make of the current decisions, or what's going to happen 6 months down the line, or maybe what's going to happen tomorrow. How can even like if like you have the Walmart, you have the Target, you have the Best Buy, you have the Medtronic, talking about those, uncertainty. What's about the small businesses? How can they even prepare, right, for this kind of, in this current environment, how can they even make business decisions? How hard is it for businesses right now to deal with all of this uncertainty?
I wish I had the economic crystal ball, and certainly I would sell it at low cost to all those small businesses that are trying to figure out what to do. I think one of the places this shows up that resonates with anybody that is looking for a job right now is that the unemployment rate right now in the economy is actually pretty low. It's
Okay.
4.2%, and that will vary based on who you are and
Yeah.
your demographics, for instance. But um, even with that, I think it ignores the fact that there isn't much churn in the labor market, which means that people aren't leaving their jobs to go to new jobs,
Yeah.
but firms also aren't firing a ton of people because they want to hang on to their current workers because they don't know what's going to happen next.
Okay.
And on one hand, that feels good because, oh, people aren't getting fired. But that means that if you did happen to lose your job or you're looking for a new job,
Yeah.
it's hard to find a job out there right now, even in this relatively uh, good time for in terms of low unemployment rate. is that
Okay.
we've been seeing it take longer and longer for people to find jobs despite a low unemployment rate. And I think that's reflective of this uncertain environment that small businesses don't necessarily know what to do, but neither do large businesses in terms of should we hire more, should we expand, or should we be doing layoffs because they don't know what's next.
Okay. There's a couple of questions here, quick. I don't know whether you have any insight into this, right? But like I mean, from the fair perspectives, right? Are banks still lending to small businesses in the current climate, right? There's so much uncertainty as we talk about. How's the lending environment like? If you have any insight into that for
Yeah.
small businesses?
The latest lending data I have seen has mostly been that banks uh, curtailed a lot of their lending for in 23 and into 24, and then it's mostly been kind of holding that. So it is a tighter lending environment for a lot of banks, and I'm guessing that well, it's a tighter lending environment, and that shows up in a couple of ways. One, in terms of the amount of lending, but also in terms of the standards for lending. So, in terms of like credit checks and income verifications, and collateral that you need. And so, those things tend to be harder for um, small businesses that are led by either women or people of color, which leads to lower lending for those type of entrepreneurs as well. And so I think it is a tough lending environment, kind of whether you're small business to big business, but
Yeah.
particularly for small businesses that are headed by anybody that doesn't have that perfect credit or
Yeah.
doesn't have the income to fall back on.
Okay. And then the other one, is this a good time for startups? I mean, it's like this growing environment for a small business, someone looking to start a business. Is it a good time?
I never want to discourage startups because you never know what the next best idea is, right? That there will always be that startup that defies the odds and comes up with the next thing that everybody wants, whether it's a
Yeah.
recession or not.
Hmm.
But when the economy and people feel worried about the economy, that's one thing that we've seen in the data is that the last 3 months we've seen declining consumer confidence.
Yeah.
People don't tend to spend as much money when they feel bad about the economy, and that's going to make it harder to get a startup off the ground. So I wouldn't say it's a good time, but that's conditional on the idea that you have and whether if it's that idea that uh, goes beyond what um, that breaks through and people need it regardless of what economic conditions are.
Okay. And this one, I think I'll rephrase it a little bit. Are there still companies like moving to Asia or South America or maybe even China? Are there still companies, right? I know I heard last time like Apple is moving out of their iPhone manufacturing from China to, I mean, to India. Are there companies trying to say, okay, where do we have lower tariffs? Where can I go? Okay. Are there companies trying to navigate the current environment?
Yeah, there are, and even in an environment where it's going to be more expensive to import stuff from countries
Mm-hmm.
across the board,
Yeah.
there are still kind of relative winners. So
Yeah.
countries like Latin America right now that only have 10% tariffs look
Yeah.
like better places to put your manufacturing than China, or
Right.
even Southeast Asia if these reciprocal tariffs end up going into place. Like Vietnam might not be the manufacturing hub that people thought it was. Uh, it's worth noting though that and I think I fall victim to this as well, thinking, "Oh, these are just factories, you can open them up wherever you want to in the world."
Yeah.
There's a lot of very specialized knowledge and manufacturing abilities that occur in China that
Yeah.
don't occur elsewhere in the world, and it's not as simple as simply, like, packing up a tent and a couple machines and moving somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like, there are real skills among Chinese manufacturing workers. There is real built up knowledge there that is not easy to move. And so some companies might be able to do this, but other companies can't in the short run. And they might just uh, sit it out because they don't know what policy is going to look like down the road.
Okay. Well, folks, this is a 1 hour show. We have kept Dr. Tyler Schipper here for the last 1 hour, 4 minutes, right? We don't, he's a professor. It's a busy time of the year. It's like graduation season is coming up. He has to grade those students, to make sure they graduate and things like that. So we'll just go a few more minutes and try to wrap this up. So tonight is the tariffs and the immigrant economy. So Peterson, give you 1 or 2 more questions, and then from there, we'll try to wrap it up. question from you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you once again, Dr. Schipper. Whenever the economy is unstable, people always, or economists, they usually recommend or suggest that people move their money into like safer assets. But for immigrant communities that have people that are already struggling, if these safer options are going to cost more, what can you recommend for those people?
Yeah. So can I ask a follow up to you? Like, what would you mean by safer options?
Yeah, because sometimes they say, "Oh, buy gold," something that is not like stock that is so volatile that can like fluctuate. So
Yeah. Yeah. That has been one of the consistencies here is that gold has been rising through most of this. And without getting too financy here, there's been because tariffs seem to be unsettling this idea that the US is the center of the global economy.
Yeah.
One of the things that typically happens is that people move their assets to the safest thing they can think of. And that usually is US government debt. So US Treasury bonds. That's not happening to the same extent this time around. That people are like, maybe the US isn't the safest place to park my money anymore.
Hmm.
And that's a little freaky. And there's a good chance that that's actually why the Trump administration backtracked on Liberation Day was that they got freaked out by the fact that it was costing more to borrow money for the US government. So I think alternative assets like gold might, if it brings people some comfort. The other thing to remember is that the US banking system is very sound. If you have an FDIC insured bank, yes, you're not getting the same type of returns, but interest rates are still a little bit elevated. And there are online banks, for instance, that offer between 3 to 4% interest. The thing to be careful of always is that over the long run, stocks tend to go up. And if you missed just a couple high performing days in the stock market, you completely ruin your rate of return. And so it's one of those things that trying to time the stock market is really difficult. But the guidance on this depends a little bit on what your investment horizon is. If you are relatively young and you've got 30 years till retirement, ride it out. If you can't sleep at night because you're trying to retire in the next 10 years, maybe it is time to take more of that money out of the stock market and try and find somewhere safer because we all need sleep and hopefully we all get to retire at some point. So
We are talking about stock market tomorrow. I wish we would bring you back, because that's gonna be tomorrow. Our
uh,
topic is, the stock.
we could. I am not a stock market expert. I love
Okay.
the how
Yeah.
the economic data then
Okay.
translates into
Yeah.
decisions in the stock market. And so
Okay.
there's a conversation there I'm happy to have at some
Sure,
point.
sure, sure,
But
sure. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Just a question here, right? I think I can phrase this right. The I mean, with so much uncertainty, right, what can folks do, right? To what should folks be participating in to prepare themselves, right? Like maybe they got bulletproof. Is it continuing education for entrepreneurs or anybody, right, to prepare for a possible recession? What should folks be doing to prepare themselves? Is it going back to school to get an extra degree or something?
Yeah. This is less from my position as like a economics professor, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of programs out there that you can work on your own computer coding, which I like, with the caveat that some of those jobs are going away because of AI. And
Yeah.
so you kind of have to find that happy medium between knowing enough about computer coding, but also how to do it faster with AI. Um,
Yeah.
because your job is not going to be a computer coder necessarily. Your job is going to be how do I use computer code to make me more effective at a job somewhere in a big company,
Yeah.
and being able to at least understand what's going on in those programs or in those gathering data from databases is going to be really important. The other thing is anything you can learn about personal finance and financial markets, I think, can be helpful both on a personal level and for companies. So I don't know as much about the certificates associated with those, but
Sure.
those are two skills that even as I do my own coding, I always wish I had more of.
Yeah.
And even as I do my own finances, I always wish I knew a little bit more.
Okay. Do you think the whole tariff environment is it going to affect innovation? I mean, the United States is known for great innovation. Is it going to affect innovation?
I'm thinking. I think so. I go back to this answer about why we want immigrants in the United States is that that's a source of innovation and that's a
Yeah.
source of jobs. And so both in terms of immigration policy, but also in terms of our current trade policy
Yeah.
making it so that people don't want to come to the US, I think those are
Sure.
both harmful to the US economy and to innovation. That it means that innovation happens elsewhere in the world rather than in the US. And I think that that's ultimately it's innovation that drives the economy forward. It's that new changes in technology that allows for future growth. And I want that to happen in the US. I'm a little bit biased in wanting our economy to do better. So I'd rather keep those good ideas and those hardworking people here.
Okay. Well, folks, tonight we have been discussing tariffs and the immigrant economy, and we'll try to wrap this up now. So, Peterson, one last question from you.
Yes, so it's not really a question. I just wanted to say thank you so much for today. I've learned a lot about the whole tariff thing that's been going on, and I'm sure our audience have too. So thank you for coming on.
Okay.
Thanks,
And
Pearson. It was great having you. I appreciate all the questions.
yeah, and Dr. Schipper, are we seeing the end of globalization, right? Because I mean, the world has been so prosperous. The United States have been, I mean, the richest economy in the world because of globalization. So many folks have, come out of poverty. Are we at the end of that? Are we ever going to see globalization as it has been, in the past?
Globalization is not there are downsides to globalization. I want to recognize that there have been people that have been left behind in a
Yeah.
globalized economy,
Yeah.
that we have not done enough in terms of public policy to make sure that people that got left behind figured out a way to reintegrate themselves in the economy.
Sure.
But it did deliver lower prices for lots of people. And I hope globalization's not done. I think that it's rough around the edges and there's lots to improve about it.
Okay.
Um, and part of the reason why I think it's probably not done is that even as the US seems to retreat, the rest of the world seems to be figuring out new ways to trade with each other. So, for instance, Europe seems to be coming closer to China, and Southeast Asian countries are becoming closer to China. And so it seems a little bit like maybe China is just going to step into the void that we're leaving. And that also worries me about the future economy, that maybe US doesn't have that same central role. So I don't think globalization's dead. I just think that maybe the US won't be benefiting from it as much as we were previously.
Okay. And then lastly, what message you would like to leave our audience tonight who has been listening to you for the last, 1 hour, 13 minutes in a great conversation? As Peterson said, you have provided great education to our audience and you are very knowledgeable about tariffs and things like that. So what's the message you want to leave our audience tonight?
Yeah, the message is I wish that I got to talk about economic policies that meant that everybody was doing better and it was
Yeah,
a
sure.
a happy-go-lucky economy. Those
Yeah.
stories very rarely happen. That this is an unfortunate policy, and I think that it's hardest to think about a policy that we decided on that's going to harm the least well off the most. And
Yeah.
I think that's what's most depressing to me about this policy is that we're making it harder to be poor in America. And that's part of the reason why economists generally are against this type of kind of far reaching tariff. So hopefully it gets rolled back. Hopefully it's just a negotiating strategy. There's a lot of hopefullys in there, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Well, Dr. Schipper, thank you so much for taking off your business schedule to join us tonight. It's been a great show. You very educate our audience tonight, and we hope maybe we can bring you back sometimes. Once everything maybe things go the other way, the economy is growing, we can bring you back to talk more about prosperity and things like that. So, but thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you have a good night. Hope your student can, end the academic year as on a good note. So thank you so much and have a good night.
You too.
Yeah. Okay, folks, and that concludes the end of our show tonight. We'll see you here tomorrow discussing the stock market, and we'll be back Thursday discussing immigration. So thank you so much, folks, and you'll have a good night.